These are some important aspects of whiteness as articulated by the Alberta Civil Liberties Research Center, which has some really good resources along these lines about race and whiteness. First is that whiteness involves social and political constructions, which implies that they are learned behaviors, not natural facts. This implies, thank goodness, that these behaviors and dispositions can be unlearned. Second, skin color is only a visible marker of the ideology, values, and behaviors, etc., that make up whiteness. Similar systems of oppression function in other places of the world that value other markers besides skin tone. So there's nothing inherently special about a person's skin pigmentation. It's just the values that are associated with it. Third, whiteness is relational. It can only exist within a relationship. Whiteness cannot exist without concepts like indigeneity, blackness, Asianness, Latinxness, etc. This is different from concepts of classification in biology, where, for example, mammals exist as a class of organisms because of certain characteristics that do not refer to other classes of organisms. It may be easier to define them or to talk about them in relation to other organisms, but they don't rely on that. Fourth, and this is a really important one, whiteness is very, very fluid and adaptable. Within the context of American whiteness, there are groups that are considered white that at one time were not considered white. Kind of an obvious case is the Irish. Because of long-standing bad blood between the English and the Irish going back a couple hundreds of years before the founding of the United States, when large numbers of Irish immigrated to the US, they were considered a fundamentally different race, and were mocked and oppressed in similar ways to other outsider groups, until political and economic necessity made Americans kind of change their position and accept them as white. We also have situations, of course, in which so-called non-white persons can pass as white. Thus, white as a social classification is really malleable. And lastly, most whites are really unconscious of their racialized positions in society. And this is because whiteness projects a world in which it is both normal and universal, right? Everybody is like this. It seems to be the assumption. I find this aspect of whiteness oddly self-contradictory, since whiteness is such a fluid concept. So to consider itself normal and universal when yet still so changeable seems contradictory. Race scholars refer to legal, cultural, economic patterns in the United States to these patterns as white supremacy or white superiority. Some, myself included, prefer to use white superiority when talking about the kind of background ideology, and using white supremacy when talking about the more overtly violent manifestations of it. Though it is important to realize that all of this is rooted in violence against outsiders. This is a photograph of a woman at a recent protest following the killing of George Floyd and others. And this sign points out kind of a privilege, a benefit of being white, and that is that if you're white, she points out here, a white woman, but if you're white, you are at less risk for state-sponsored violence through police brutality than if you're African American, specifically if you're African American male. But it's important again to notice that these are related concepts, and that violence is very much a part of whiteness. To kind of bring that to the front, we have to point out a very uncomfortable fact about white superiority, and that is that it is deliberate. It is the backbone of the American system. On this slide, I've noted just some of the selected laws and legal decisions that have contributed to the creation and maintenance of white superiority and white supremacy. These laws, in many cases, seem to sanction violence against non-white persons. Let me just point out a specific example. The 1790 Naturalization Act. This is one of the first major pieces of legislation enacted or created under the new Constitution, and it helped define who could become a citizen versus, who was born a citizen, right? And it begins with language: all free white persons who have or shall migrate to the United States. And this was built on similar state laws that existed in Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. And so this idea of white persons being equated with citizenship is older than the Constitution. So this concept of whiteness was enshrined in law from the very beginning. It's important to note that whiteness has not always just kind of been able to run free. There have been challenges to it all along. And the way I'm kind of coming to think of it is that the civil rights era is rooted really in post-World War I America, when soldiers of color came back from the war in Europe and saw from a new perspective just how the proverbial cards were stacked against them. But they also saw that it didn't have to be that way. Whiteness as a system is not the same in Europe, so they could see a different way for things to be. And so really from the 1920s and 30s onward, there have been more concerted efforts to deconstruct the legal frameworks of racism, which is referred to as de jure racism, racism of the law. However, these efforts have had very limited effect in many cases, have had very little effect on de facto racism, or racism of the facts, meaning referring to kind of everyday experience of racism.